welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Let's call this part 41 of Mussolini, an Italian-American experience. And guys, tonight, I want to talk about political sourcing, historical sourcing, and how difficult it really is to kind of go through the weeds of a notorious character like Benito Mussolini, because he invokes such political drama. Let's put it that way, because of the, again, the historical sensibilities of our time. As I said to you before, fascism is a word that's thrown around a lot these days, and I would argue that fascism no longer exists anywhere in the world, even though in our political systems, it's a word that's thrown out every 5 minutes. That the left calls the right fascist, the right calls the left fascist, and it's fascinating as a as a guy who's taking this thing very seriously and very deep now, the historical study of fascism, particularly Benito Mussolini. I will tell you that historical true fascism has only existed in one nation in the history of the world at one given time, and that was Italy in the 1920s and 30s. But nevertheless, this word sort of brings about a lot of different sensibilities, and it's thrown around, and it leads to a lot of historical problems in trying to properly analyze that era. As you guys know, I've gone through at least 2 to 3 dozen books on Benito Mussolini and Italian fascism. That doesn't count the countless other hours of looking for sources on the internet and videos and things of that nature. And what I found is that there's really two polar opposite views on Benito Mussolini. One that's very politically driven, one that comes from the liberal communist world, and then there's one that's more nuanced and a little bit more balanced, right? When I first got into, let me put it this way. When I first decided to get my first book on Mussolini, as my curiosity had been kind of, about 4 or 5 years ago now, have kind of increased, and I wanted to study Mussolini. The first book I got was Nicholas Farrell's Mussolini: A New Life. And ironically enough, the way I discovered this book, because I was looking for a book on Mussolini, but I didn't want this one-sided kind of, pro and the other one kind of, anti. I wanted something that was fair and balanced. I kind of did a quick search on the Google here, and I found an article, of all places, the Daily Beast, right, which is a liberal rag, and they were going after Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon worked for President Trump, right, political analyst. And Steve Bannon recommended a book about Mussolini, and his take was basically, you know what, it's a good book, and maybe we ought to consider, some of the things that Mussolini did. I was shocked by that, to be honest with you. And he recommended Nicholas Farrell's Mussolini: A New Life, which was he described it as a kind of a balanced approach to Mussolini. Yeah, he did some bad things, but there's some things that, ought to be considered, that Mussolini was interesting, innovative, and he called a few things right. And that's when I ordered that book. And what's fascinating about Nicholas Farrell's book is that it comes from that more moderate wing of sort of, when we study Italian fascism and Mussolini. It's that wing of Renzo Di Felice, who is Jewish, and he is what's considered the official biographer of Benito Mussolini. He takes more of what's considered now a revisionist perspective on Mussolini, where they look at the documents, they look at the history, and try to eliminate the politics, right? So this is why you get the good and the bad with Mussolini. There's not that sort of liberal judgment that we see oftentimes on the other side of the aisle, where they take more of a polemic view on Mussolini from the sort of classical liberal communist side. And that's what was fascinating about it. And when Nicholas Farrell, in his book, right in the introduction, he says the reason why he wrote this book and he took the Renzo Di Felice kind of historical approach to this for one reason only. Renzo Di Felice stuck with the historical facts. He did not throw his political bias in there. He went to the documents themselves, to the documents of the Italian fascist regime, the historical documents. He stuck to the history. He stuck to the documents and tried to remove as much as he could his political opinion about Italian fascism and Benito Mussolini. And this is kind of the school of thought that Nicholas Ferro in his book, Mussolini New Life, he stuck with that. And it was the first book I read, and it was fascinating because it does give you the good with the bad. On one hand, Mussolini made a lot of terrible mistakes that cost him, but even more so, the Italian nation with World War II. On the other hand, Nicholas Ferro says, listen, he wasn't a mass murderer. He was a mild dictator, and he's not as evil as he's been portrayed despite all of these mistakes. And the book, which is a huge book, it's almost really a Bible of sorts. He's not an official biographer or historian of Mussolini, but he follows the Renzo Di Felice school of thought. Now, the Renzo Di Felice 8-volume set on Mussolini has never been translated into English. And this is why I haven't got that set yet. And I would love to have that if I could get it in English. I read a little bit Italian, but I would miss the nuances in that. I wish we would get that English translation. But this is the school of thought that I followed. And so when I see certain things online that take a more, I guess, hard line, kind of liberal view on this, that simply diminish the character as being a brute or a maniacal, power-hungry kind of historical figure, it's kind of strange and odd because the 3 books that I have read, which I often cite here, I put right on the graphics, or I put them in the description here. It gives a different narrative, which shows you that there is a war out there in history. History is just as political as anything else, really. And trying to siphon through this thing and trying to get to truth oftentimes about a very consequential historical figure is difficult. And you have to read a lot, and you have to compare and contrast and take notes and keep track of the thinking and the process that goes into a historical figure like this. And then you have to decide here what you want to believe, right? Kind of a thing, right? So recently, I've been kind of cruising the internet, and I've ran into 3 different, I guess, authors that have the other side of the view, right? The liberal Marxist side of the view that try to make a grave charge against Mussolini and how he governed specifically. But in these articles or with these particular authors, there's something that needs to be considered because their perspective does come with a certain bias. And I want to highlight these to you tonight, okay? I think it's easy for you. You guys have gotten the Renzo Di Felice school of thought, what is considered the revisionist history of Mussolini Italian fascism. That's what I've used here to be fair and balanced in my own way in this entire series. But I want to point to the other side here and what they're saying and some of the curious propositions that they propose and some of the problems that I see on that side that I would sure like to get clarity on, right? When we remove the biases from history, and I get it, you can't completely remove it, but we can try to be as fair and balanced to history as we can, okay? So let me go to the share screen here, okay? And I want to start with, let's see here. Let's see here. Let's go here, okay? So I'm cruising. Let me make this bigger here. Sorry, guys. So I was cruising YouTube. I saw this a couple of months ago, but it popped up again on my feed. There is a docudrama novel about Mussolini that was made in Italy, I think a year or 2 ago. And it's called Mussolini's Son of the Century, right? You can see here, there's a trailer here. I won't play it for you guys, but here's kind of the layout. You could type in Mussolini's Son of the Century, and this will pop up on your YouTube feed. And I've been watching clips of it on YouTube here for the last few days, trying to get a feel for it to see where this author or the creators of this series go. Now, it's in Italian. It's done by Italians. It's done for Italian audiences. And so getting some of, what do you want to call it, the details, the behind-the-scenes stories of a series like this that tries to make, again, a historical case for Mussolini himself is very difficult for me. And I'll appeal to some, I guess, shallow sources, basically Wikipedia, until I can find out more, because Wikipedia has some very interesting tidbits about this particular series, Italian series, on Benito Mussolini. Now, when you watch the different clips of this series on YouTube, I mean, they really make the case that he was a maniacal, conniving, power hungry historical figure, sex drenched, and always plotting to sort of, acquire power for his own, aggrandizement, if you want to call it that, right? Right. And I always find it fascinating as I watch these, because this is not the historical figure that I've read about again, the 3 dozen sources that I've read. And I've given you a lot of the nuances here, right? That he wasn't just a particular historical caricature that was necessarily tyrannical or necessarily evil per se. He might have done some things in leadership, right, in time of Italy, as I pointed out. But this caricature that's made in the post-war consensus of what is ultimately the justification or the attempt to justify the post-war consensus from a liberal perspective is clearly obvious and biased here, right? So I said, okay, this series is pretty one-sided, right? What do we got here? Who are the creators of this, right? Again, I know a little bit about Italian society and culture. I follow a little bit, but I'm not on the inside like American society, okay? So I did a simple search, and I got to the creator of this series, and I'll pull it up here. Antonio Scurati, right? And Antonio Scurati, Italian guy. I think he's professor of comparative literature and creative writing at the University of Milan, mass media scholar, editor for the Corriere, it's Italian, let me pronounce this right, the Corriere della Sera, right? I believe some publication over there. Scurati has won the main Italian literary prizes in 2019. He is awarded the prestigious Strega Prize for his novel, Mussolini, Son of the Century, 2018. Okay, so 2018, not a couple years ago, 2018. The first volume in a series of 5 books dedicated to Benito Mussolini and Italian fascism. It was at the top of the charts for 2 consecutive years, was translated into over 40 languages, and has been adapted into a television series. Okay, and that's what I'm getting on YouTube, and it does come in subtitles because it's done in Italian. But here's the interesting part about what Wikipedia follows up with here, okay? Listen to this. In September 2018, Scurati published the novel Mussolini, Son of the Century, the first volume in a series of 5 books about Benito Mussolini. The pentalogy intends to tell the history of Italy beginning on March 23rd, 1919, the day that Italian fascists or fasces of combat was founded and ended in 1945. The novel concludes with Mussolini's speech to the Chamber of Deputies on January 3rd, 1925, which officially established Italy as a dictatorship. The political crisis caused the murder of Giacomo Matteotti. The first edition of the novel contained 8 historical errors, okay, in terms of names, dates, and quotations that were detailed by Ernesto Galli della Loggia in the Corriere della Sera, where he criticized Scurati for having retouched the history with his novel. Scurati responded to the controversy in a column also published in the Corriere della Sera. In it, he argued that the current era requires a cooperation between the rigor of historical accuracy and the art of the novel, and that telling is an art, not an exact science. The controversy also involved Pierluigi Battista, to which Galli della Loggia wrote again, stating, quote, "Creative license does not authorize betraying the truth of history." In an interview to Il Manifesto that was printed on April 23rd, 2019, Scurati stated that giving a voice to Mussolini serves to free us from him, and added, quote, "Above all, it means dealing with the repressed collective conscience. Fascism as one of the matrices, I believe, of national identity, and doing so through a new, popular, and inclusive narrative according to the vocation of the novel form. I was driven by the belief that, quote, after the historical fall of the anti-fascist prejudice, a novel about Mussolini was possible and therefore necessary precisely to renew the reasons for anti-fascism. So, a couple things here that are important here. One, he's making up historical facts. This series is, right? And you could tell, again, by the sort of the conniving madman, going after the power and not stopping until he gets all the power in his hands. You could see that there's a problem in the series right away. At least I noticed it, right? And so he's making up history. He's getting up historical facts. And he goes so far as to say that, well, it's not a perfect science. We're telling a story here, right? Right? A little bit of a problem. But even more so, he says here, at the end, I was driven by the belief that after the historical fall of anti-fascist prejudice, a novel about Mussolini was possible, therefore necessary precisely to renew the reasons for anti-fascism. So what he's claiming, the Surati, who lied about the historical accuracies, he's saying that what do you call it here? The revisionist history has fallen. It's fallen. It's collapsed. It's been discredited. It's been debunked. So the Renzo de Felices and the Nicholas Farrows, they write these books. It's all been debunked. So now it's time to bring this conversation again. Now, I haven't heard that the revisionist history of Mussolini has been debunked. That's kind of, and again, I'm not in Italy. I'm not in Italian society. I'm sure they got a better hold of this than I ever do, right? I'm in America. I'm going through as many of the resources I can to try and present it to you guys. But again, here, there's a problem here. There's a problem. And that is, we're creating history here is what we're creating. And we're using dramas, and we're basically using a basic tenet that fascism, as deemed by the anti-fascists, was such an evil institution. Mussolini was so maniacally myopic and evil and tyrannical that we have to make sure, again, that we get this story straight. But again, we're doing it with great historical inaccuracies, right? That's part of the problem here, right? So let me read this next paragraph to you, or at least there's one paragraph here. On the night between July 4th and 5th, 2019, Mussolini Il Figlio della Secolo was awarded the prestigious Strega Prize. And Scarlatti commented, I dedicate the victory to our grandfathers and fathers who were first seduced and then oppressed by fascism, especially those among them who found the courage to fight it with weapons in hand. Okay, so he's saying basically our fathers and grandfathers, they were idiots. They fell for fascism, the seduction of fascism, and then they picked up arms to take down fascism and Mussolini. Okay, he's talking about the partisans. He's talking about the Italian Civil War between 43 and 45. Of course, the problem there is that the partisans, in large part, were Marxists. That's who the partisans were. There were some non-Marxist elements of it, but only because the Marxists, which was the controlling force of the partisan movements, right, welcomed everybody in because they needed everybody that they could, right? But the fact is, these minions were fighting on behalf of the Soviet Union and Stalin. That's the reality of what he's saying here. So their fathers and grandfathers were all dumb and stupid, deceived, right? And then so now we pick up the pieces to tell the story for them, to vindicate them, because they picked up the arms right next to the Marxists and they fought fascism. Okay? Do we see a problem there? We may, because again, the Catholic world, the Latin West, was much more willing to work with fascism than it was Marxism. Marxism was condemned specifically by the church, but fascism was never condemned by the church. Never. Okay, let's keep that in mind. And why? Because the fascists never abolished the natural and the moral law. The Marxists did. So keep in mind what he's saying here. All right. Let me read one more paragraph. Let's see what it says here. In September 20th, Mussolini, L'Uomo della Provvidenza, the second volume of the quartet, was published. It follows the rise of Mussolini from 1925 to 1932, recounting his liberticidal politics and the fierce power struggles and ideological battles of the National Fascist Party. It framed by the omnipresent figure of Mussolini and his mediocrities and eccentricities. The novel was translated into France and was awarded the European Book Prize in September. The third volume of the series was released, Mussolini gli ultimi giorni della Europa, which follows the fateful years of 1938 to 1940 that will lead Italy into the World War II. The series initially planned as a trilogy. Let's see, let me screen. In October 2022, Scorati, again, that's the creator of the series, commented, at this point, it is clear that I would need a fourth and perhaps a fifth complete story. Blah, 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 blah. Let me scroll down. And I think that's pretty much it. Let me see here. Hold on here. This is interesting. After the results of the 2022 Italian general elections showed the Brothers of Italy, a political party with roots dating back to the Italian socialist movement that was founded by neo-fascists and Mussolini's followers after World War II, was the most voted largest party in the Italian parliament. Scorati described FDL leader and future Italian Prime Minister Giorgio Meloni as an heir of Mussolini in an interview to Le Dauphine Libere. He had observed that what is happening today in Italy is not a repetition of the past, but the resounding victory in Italy of a party that has its cultural and ideological roots in fascism. Excuse me, I'm screwing this up, guys. But resounding victory in Italy of a party that has its cultural and ideological roots in fascism is a fact. Italy is threatened by those parties that are the heirs of Mussolini, not so much as fascisms, but as inventors of populism. For April 25th celebrations, the Italian resistance movement to Nazi fascism in 2024, Scorati was scheduled to deliver a monologue for the Italian public television, Raya, warning that the specter of fascism haunts the house of Italian democracy. He was subsequently removed from the Raya 3 program, Cersata, hosted by Sereno Bertone, who criticized the governor's choice and said no explanation was given. This prompted criticism from parts of the Italian press, which published his monologue and outcry from the opposition, as well as censorship accusations, which were denied by the Meloni government. So here's the point. He's a leftist. That's what it sounds like to me, right? He's pointing out the Meloni government. Again, Meloni had some issues in the past where she praised Mussolini, right? She rises to power. She's kind of backed off of that a little bit because it's just not kosher in this day and age in a world governed by liberal democracies, right? But he's pointing out his bias here, without a doubt. At least that's how I read this Wikipedia article here, that clearly he has a problem with right-wing governments. And maybe that's the problem with Mussolini. You see the bias here. So Mussolini, son of the century, just getting behind some of the ideas of what people are thinking, at least in Italy, right? And this series that to me comes off a little bit problematic because you could see it with subtitles, but you also get a feel for it, right? The way the character is presented, right? It's tries to create a very dark character, a character that they're trying to define in this novel as being somewhat maniacal and evil, I guess you could say. So what do we get with this series in Italy? Well, we get history that's been lied about, historical inaccuracies, a novel that's tinkering with history, passing as a truth to stand up for supposedly the fathers and the grandfathers who would eventually fight with the Marxists against fascists, and eventually we get the political ideology that goes against Meloni, right? Who is considered to have historical ties to Mussolini and fascism. A clear leftist bias And this is being presented in Italy sort of as a novel to influence the historical opinion of this historical figure, whatever side you want to take. So that's number one. Mussolini, son of the century. Take that as you will. Give me a second, guys. Okay, let's move on to the next source here. I got again. Let's go to what do we got here? No, not that one. Okay, this is another historian. His name is what? Well, the other guy wasn't a historian. He was just a media guy making a novel. This is an actual historian on Italian fascism. This is his expertise. His name is R.J. Bosworth. He's written a bunch of books on Italian history. He has a novel on Mussolini. He also has a, not a novel, excuse me. He has a history book on Mussolini. He also wrote a book on Clara Petacci. He's written books on Italian life in the 1920s and 30s. And this is another character that's fascinating. And as we go into Wikipedia, again, I'm not considering Wikipedia a great source, but there's some things to consider here, if true, right? Richard James Boone Bosworth is an Australian historian, an author, and leading expert on Benito Mussolini and fascist Italy, having written extensively on both topics. Bosworth received his bachelor's and master's from the University of Sydney before going on to a doctoral study at St. John's in Cambridge, held various teaching positions at University of Sydney, University of West Australia, University of Reading, and has also held various fellowships, including fellow Academy of Social Sciences in Australia, fellow of the Australia. Okay, you guys get the point. He's got the pedigree because he's some kind of a professional guy in the historical sciences, right? So this is supposed to give him the credibility that he deserves to tell us all what Italian fascism, particularly Benito Mussolini, was all about in those days. Okay, let's skip down here. Let's see what it says here about what he writes about Benito Mussolini, which is fascinating. Right here we go. Here in the section publications, Benito Mussolini and the fascist destruction of liberal Italy. Bosworth wrote his first book as part of a series, Topics in Modern History, seeking to assist high school and university teachers and students providing a guiding and stimulating overview of fascist Italy, rather than an in-depth historical analysis. That's interesting, right? Okay. Noting that fascist Italy has not garnered the attention of Nazi Germany, Bosworth makes clear his anti-fascist tone from the beginning, aiming for a more serious study of Italian fascism than is usually given by Anglo-Saxons, misinterpreting and misunderstanding Italian history. He presents Italy up to 1945 as pretending to be a great power in Europe, despite poor geography and resources, argues that this pretense has taken its toll. Okay. Next section here, Italy, the least of the great powers. As the title implies, Bosworth argues that Italy was largely ignored by the other major world powers at the beginning of the First World War. The book constitutes a severely critical analysis of Italian diplomatic aims and methods, stemming from Bosworth's Cambridge PhD thesis. Italy, the least of the great powers, has been said to possess an extraordinarily rich and complete bibliography. Here again, Bosworth presents Italy as possessing the numbers and history of a great power, but really closer to a small state or colony in identity. In this book, in which Bosworth argues that the Italian king Victor Emmanuel III was merely a figurehead. Okay, some truth and some BS, right? I mean, truth in that Italy didn't have a lot of resources. Italy's economy was largely agricultural. It was. And I think this is why ultimately Mussolini never wanted to go into World War II. And I've talked about the diplomatic issues and how Italy got to World War II. It's a little bit more nuanced than I think Mr. Bosworth would most likely conclude. And here, you know, taking a shot at the king as being merely a figurehead, okay, maybe, but Mussolini was appointed by the king. It's got to mean something on behalf of the monarch. Maybe not the strongest monarch, you could argue, sure, but he was in charge, or at least had the authority to set up the government of Italy at the time. Granted, might have been poorly run at times, especially before Mussolini comes into power, but nevertheless, a little bit more than a figurehead. It's kind of tough. But I digress. All right, here we go. Italy and the approach of the First World War, 1983. Bosworth discusses the various influences in Italy preceding the country's entrance into the First World War. He argues that Italian Foreign Minister Antonio di San Giuliano single-handedly controlled Italian foreign policy and rejected Italian responsibility to honor the Triple Alliance. Accordingly, Bosworth presents the Italian king, Victor Emmanuel III, as a figurehead, delegating power and rarely making positive foreign interventions. Bosworth portrays decision makers largely uninfluenced by extreme measures, including an Italian public who wanted peace. All right. Hiroshima, Nagasaki. I'll skip that. Okay. Let's get to Italy and the wider world here. No. Italy and the wider world, 1996. Bosworth seeks to organize a collection of contradictory images from the Italian past and Italy's present, jostles for attention, both for Italian self-understanding and for the understanding of outsiders, such as there are many Italies to be pondered, both in the scholarship of historian or of other experts and in the popular mind. Bosworth agrees with Antonio Gramsci and others that commentators must acknowledge the intricacies of Italian history, such as Italy's differing histories between the North and the South, country and rural, or government population. Bosworth emphasizes the discrepancy in vision of legal bureaucracy and real population. Italy, especially concerning dreams of empire, Bosworth uses the notion of paese, an Italian word for both country and village, to illustrate the complexities of Italian nationhood, stating that each paese can be seen as a world-ranging community or simply a village. May agree with some of that. But here we go. Now we get to Mussolini and the problems of perspective in interpretation of Mussolini and fascism. Here we go. In this personally inflected book, Bosworth analyzes changing interpretations of Italian fascism over time and their impact on Italian society, emphasizing how these interpretations have been shaped by their environments. Bosworth opposes the work of Emilio Gentile and Renzo De Felice. Here we go, right? He doesn't side with the revisionists, right? He accuses both of being anti-fascist, failing to adequately condemn Italian fascism, although this stance has been criticized as politicizing scholarly activity. Same thing as the movie, right? Right? Son of the Century, right? We're politicizing history, right? Bosworth argues that recent scholarship has deflected the field away from its moral and political purpose, which is to be vigilant against renewed fascism and protective of anti-fascism, attributing this failure to cultural relativism and postmodernism. There it is. Boom. His mission is to make sure that we condemn fascism. And as I said to you many times before, sometimes when we get a history narrative by a lot of liberals and Marxists, I often tell you, like for example, when the classical liberals would tell you that all the monarchs of the old world were all tyrannical, evil. And I always tell you guys, what I tell you guys, that's not history they're preaching to you, it's politics. Bosworth here is laying out his political narrative, and he's using it under the cover of a historian. That's what I see here. Okay, if I'm wrong, you guys correct me in the chat. Let me know where I'm wrong. Okay, the book has been accused of being unnecessarily polemic, dismissing much of the work done in the last 20 years, which has focused more on specific elements of Italian fascism, like ideology, cultural products, government policy, gender relations, sexuality, and public and private space. In other words, again, going back to the revisionist history, that's what it's called, right? The school of thought of Renzo De Felice, sticking to the facts, reading the documents. They don't like that. These liberal stories don't like that. That's what it sounds like to me, at least. I could be wrong here. But again, as Nicholas Farrell said about Renzo de Felice, he's the only one, or at least one of the few ones, that stuck to the historical records and didn't invoke his own political ideology into history books under the guise of historian, Italian historian, specifically fascist Mussolini historian. It's all being laid out. This is what I'm seeing here, right? Let's see here, Mussolini 2002. This is his book. In this biography, Bosworth concentrates less on Mussolini's personality than his political actions, leading to an avowedly anti-fascist study of the Duce. The book begins with Mussolini's final 2 years, then explains how he got there. Bosworth presents Mussolini as a bully, a coward, and a failure, who could not effectively modernize Italy, who represented the Italy of his time. Bosworth particularly criticized Mussolini's leadership in the late 1930s and portrays him as more of a people pleaser than an ideologue. He even controversially contends that Mussolini might have entered history as a figure of some light and some darkness had he retired in 1932. Okay, so the thing with Mussolini is this. Because historians cannot corner him on the mass murder sort of genre, right? Like Hitler, Stalin, Mao, who murdered millions of people. You just don't see that with Mussolini, right? And so what has been the effective mode of attacking him from the liberal Marxist side is to say that he was a buffoon. Or in the case of Bosworth here, right, saying basically he was a coward, he was ineffective, a people pleaser, basically anything to try and discredit any of the accomplishments that Mussolini had between the 20s and 30s. And yet there was a bunch of accomplishments. But he's presented as, again, a bully, a coward, and a failure. And it discounts lots of things that happened, good things that happened in Italy at that time, which we've highlighted here, right? Mussolini did get the economy going. Was it perfect after the 1929 stock market crash that happened in America? No, it got a little tough there after 1929 for a few years, but he managed through it. Mussolini solved the question Romana, right? Which made Italy a Catholic integral state. And listen, a lot of these writers aren't even Catholic writers, so they completely miss the importance of the church and what he accomplished in Italy with the church. They totally missed this and really don't ever really address it. He gave Italians their identity because before the question Romana, which he settled through, again, the Lateran Accords, Italians were all discombobulated. Nobody even knew what an Italian was. After the Lateran Accords, bringing the church in, there you had Italy, really, a conscience voice. And yes, those divisions still exist, but an attempt to put sort of a legal government together where you bring citizens together through the rule of law really happens in Italy as a result of the, Lateran Accords. Was Mussolini a failure in that respect? Now, if you're arguing for subsidiarity and you believe that Italy should have stayed all divided and providential and all that stuff, fine, I get that. But in a modern sense, you could argue this is a good thing, right? So here we go again. We have another historian or another figure trying to dictate history here that imports or infuses his politics into his history books and mask his political opinions under the guise of a historian here, right? It's been clearly laid out. It's been accused of being polemic and divisive. He's not using the facts per se, but charging what oftentimes he believes is the important narrative in establishing the anti-fascist cause. And what I would suggest is that this sounds more political than it sounds like a historical take, an honest historical take, right? So that's number two. That's, again, supposed historian R.J.B. Bosworth. You'll see a lot of books on him on Amazon. And if you go to a Barnes and Noble, you'll see that they carry all of his books. He's one of the more popular ones. But here again, we're laying out the case that there's a problem here. All right. Finally, the last article. I was cruising again. I was looking, I was doing research for this cast on the relation between Padre Pio and Benito Mussolini, because there's a story there and I got to get it right before I do a cast on that. And I was doing research and I came across this article on Substack here, right? Is this it right here? I'm having problems here. Let me see. Is this an ad? Yes, it's an ad. Okay. So, The Saint and the Dictator, Unexpected Contemporaries, by a gentleman by the name of Greg Cook. And listen, this gentleman seems like a fine guy. He seems like a good Catholic, but he's trying to come up with a story and what it must have been like for Padre Pio to live at a time with Benito Mussolini, two very consequential figures that basically were born and lived in the same period. And, you know, he asked the questions, could they have met at some point? And what does that mean? But invariably, he uses a historian by the name of Dennis Mack Smith to make his case for Mussolini. And once again, it's a perspective, well, that's highly polarized. Again, and I'll get to it, right? I'll get to it, right? Here we go. The Saint and the Dictator by Greg Cook. Have you ever realized, excuse me, let me do it here. Have you ever realized that two figures you had placed in their own boxes were actually contemporaries, or wondered if two contemporaries have ever met? I've wondered about the possible meeting between Fulton Sheen and Marcel Lefebvre. I think he's a traditionalist Catholic. That's good. While reading the concluding pages of a biography about Benito Mussolini, the thought came to me that he and Padre Pio were not just countrymen, but contemporaries. And what a divergent pair, right? The stigmatic friar and saint lived from 1987 to 1968. The fascist dictator spanned 1883 to 1945. Mussolini's life cut short with the execution by partisans. Both served in the Italian army during World War I. Both began their careers in the years after the war. Both were born into rural families. Neither received an education of the highest caliber, though Padre Pio's was certainly better and more extensive. Pio's parents were devout. Mussolini's mother was a strong Catholic, but his father was an anti-clerical. Mussolini counted himself as an Italian northerner, while Padre Pio hailed from the central and more southern influenced part of the country. All fair takes, all fair takes. Their lives were opposite of each. Mussolini's goal was to attain power, which he did in 1922. He became a noteworthy, though often reviled or at least mocked character on the world stage. His pronouncements, his flip-flops, and murderous rule caused him to be hated by many. Pio trod the path of the little man of Assisi, placed himself under obedience to his superiors, even when meant reviling and persecution. And was rewarded with the painful stigmata. Despite his hiddenness, he became known around the world as the wonder worker and the living saint. The dictator appealed to the pride and hunger for goods and power, but the saint embodied humility. Stop there for a minute. The dictator, I'm repeating here, the dictator appealed to pride and hunger for goods and power. I'll leave the power claim aside, because certainly not only dictators, but also democratically elected politicians all seek power to one degree or another. The question is, what is their moral guiding light in terms of power? Mussolini, as I said before, distributed power and made the church the third stool of Italian politics with the Lateran Accords. He actually relinquished power in the 1929 Lateran Accords. He gave Pope Pius XI the church great power. Yes, Mussolini had power. I'm just not sure that it was necessarily a misguided power to the degree that's described by, again, another liberal historian. It also says here, had a hunger for goods. Did he? Mussolini was known as the poor dictator. Mussolini, if you know him and you study him, hated money, despised money. He never even took a salary as the prime minister of Italy. He did it for the honor of serving Italy. His wife bitterly complained over and over and over again, you are the leader of Italy. You're the most powerful man in Italy. And yet you bring home no money. The nobles live better than we do. She bitterly complained, I need more money to run this household. But Mussolini would have nothing of it. They lived off their little salary, their newspaper, Il Popolo d'Italia, which didn't make a lot of money. In fact, in her book, the biography that Rochelle Mussolini wrote about Mussolini, not only did she bitterly complain about the lack of money Mussolini brought home, but that one day, she said, quote, when he dies, they'll find nothing on him. No money, only a handkerchief. That's how much Mussolini despised money. That's why he was called the poor dictator. So just a little nuance there, I guess you could say, if you want to call it that. Let's see here. Mussolini's legacy is worthless. He nearly destroyed the country. He led an unleashed civil war and hatred. Padre Piu's legacy is devotion to the Mass, the call to sanctity, and the hospital he helped found. Okay, Mussolini does deserve, in my opinion, does deserve blame for the war. Should have stayed out of it. Again, there's much more nuance there, but I'll give partial credit here, right? But also, too, Padre Piu's legacy is devotion to the Mass and call thing. Yes, Padre Piu was awesome. I get that. But remember, Mussolini gave the church back its power, gave the church back its rightful place in society. In fact, the day that the Lateran Accords were signed, it was a Monsignor of the church that went to the house of the Mussolinis with a bottle of champagne. Donna Mussolini, your husband has done it. He's restored the glory of the church in Italy. That was the celebration at the Mussolini house. That's according to Rochelle Mussolini. Benito did a lot of great things for the church that he's not given credit for because he's overshadowed by the effects of the war and the liberal bias, the post-World War II liberal consensus that's been created. Let's always remember that. Okay? Let me keep reading. The books pictured above and listed below help illustrate these two paths. Dennis Mack Smith's, and that's the key here, Dennis Mack Smith, biography paints a picture of a lonely, hollow man with no core convictions, no morality, and no friends. So problematic. No core convictions. No core convictions for Mussolini. Doesn't know Mussolini. Mussolini loved Italy. Mussolini loved his family. And Mussolini converted to the Catholic faith at the end of his life. He was always gravitating there. Mussolini got married in the church. Eventually, he was secularly married when he was a communist, but eventually he wanted to be on sound footing with the church. He got married in church, baptized all of his kids. All of his kids got married in the church. He honored and respected the faith. He had core convictions, right? He fought communism. He put his life on the line to fight communism, to save Italy. That's why the king called on him. No core convictions? Are we sure about that? I digress. No morality and no friends. Mussolini struggled with adultery, no doubt about that. But then again, what man in power hasn't? I'm not excusing it. It's a byproduct of power. As far as friends is concerned, yes, he didn't have a lot of friends. Guess what? A lot of men don't have a lot of friends because they're secure in who they are. In fact, a man with very little friends, right, is a sign of great security within who that individual man is. Okay, something to think about. Let's move on here. Let's see where I left off here. Let's see here. No convictions. Okay. The book assembled by Thomas Convolinka presents Padre Piu up close and in his everyday life outside the Mass and confession. It is told by an American soldier who became one of his spiritual children. The novel, The Red House, is based on real life happenings and helps the reader understand life in Mussolini's Italy. These ordinary people wrestle with matters of faith, conscience, patriotism, and politics. There is action on the Russian front as well as at home. The struggle against communism is a central theme. Mussolini, a socialist as a young man, never really shed his socialist ideas. His fall from power helped instigate a civil war in which the communists nearly succeeded in gaining power. Catholicism was the main defense against communist takeover in our secular and ungodly era with a lack of saints. What is to prevent the spread of communist and other ungodly ideas? Well, I'm glad, the communist fight in Italy was brought up, because oftentimes that isn't brought up, and the fascists were there as a counterbalance to the communists. We know that's the case I've made all along. But so the source here that Mr. What's his name here? Greg Cook used was this book right here. All right. Kind of flashing over Mussolini. It's a biography by Dennis Mack Smith. Now, why don't we do this? Let's see if I get there. I'm just trying to maneuver here. We go to Amazon, right? This is, you can buy this book, Dennis Mack Smith. Now, it's an older book written in 1977. This is before we get the counterbalance on the history of Mussolini and Italian fascism. This is before the time of what we would eventually have, was considered, again, revisionist history, right? Even though Renzo De Felice did write or started writing his novel, I believe, in the 60s, right? But something happened starting right around the 90s where people were picking up on De Felice and started writing different, focusing again on the historical facts rather than the politics, right? And it's interesting because Dennis Mack kind of writes as a liberal writer, kind of takes some of the same liberal logic. And I'm cruising through the comments to see what people are saying. And it's fascinating. I found one here that's absolutely fascinating, guys, right? And it's going to tell you a lot about the book, because he's talking about the book here. I don't know how to pronounce this gentleman's name, or it's a screen name, Miltiades Michaelopoulos, right? Gave it a 2 stars, lacking depth and balance. Interesting. Let's start. Dennis Mack Smith's biography, Mussolini, is widely regarded as a classic and informative account of the Italian dictator and fascist regime. However, it suffers from an ideological bias. Surprise, surprise, another ideological bias, just like the previous 2 sources we use, right? And a lack of historical nuance, offering one-sided portrayal that downplays Mussolini's capabilities and ignores the broader context of his era. The biography opens by labeling Mussolini as a very unusual person and proceeds to depict him as erratic, egotistical, politically inconsistent. While these traits were indeed present, Mack Smith's portrayal ignores important qualities such as Mussolini's rhetorical skill, political adaptability, and early administrative successes. Even his political opponents, like Churchill, once admired his charisma and early achievements. Presenting Mussolini purely as a disordered opportunist overlooks the reasons why he gained popular support in the first place and why he kept it for 21 years, the longest reigning, and this is me adding this, the longest reigning leader in in Europe of his time. Nobody was in power more than Mussolini between the 20s and the 30s, right? Right? You don't do that if you're a buffoon and an idiot. Again, we're selling something here, but let's keep reading, right? A major shortcoming of this book is its failure to contextualize Mussolini's ideological transformation from socialism to nationalism. Very important, right? Born into a socialist household, Mussolini was an anti-war, anti-imperialist activist who worked for the socialist newspaper Avanti. Exactly right. And was imprisoned for his views. Yet, with the outbreak of World War I, he reversed course and supported Italy's entry into the war, a decision that remains underexplored in Mack Smith's account. In my opinion, Mussolini's shifts reflect not just personal opportunism, but also the widespread cultural embrace of war in early 20th century Europe, where conflict was often seen as a unifying and purifying force. Such contextual factors, largely absent from this biography, are essential to understanding his ideological journey. The book also emphasizes fascist violence as essential to Mussolini's rise, focusing on the activities of fascist squads and high-profile acts of political terror. While these events are accurately described, Mack Smith fails to place them in the broader interwar climate, which saw significant left-wing violence as well. including socialist militias and widespread labor unrest in Italy, without acknowledging the mutual escalation of violence between left and right. The narrative appears biased and oversimplified. What have I told you guys on this cast, right? I've told you the fascists only rise because it is, again, Marxists that are filling into Italy. It is the king that turns to Mussolini and the fascists to combat the Marxists. Again, Italy at the time being a weaker, constitutional monarchy at the time. The king didn't want to send his army out. He didn't want what happened in Russia in 1919 with the Bolshevik Revolution happening in Italy in 2022. So he kind of subcontracts out the fascists to combat the Marxists who were trying to have, again, a Marxist revolution in Italy. After Mussolini pushed them out, guess where those Marxists went? They went to Spain. And we get the Spanish Civil War, and Mussolini has to go in and help Franco there at the time. You see how this plays out? See how this plays out? And again, we're not acknowledging political events on the ground to be fair and balanced here, right? We're getting biased historical stories here. We're getting people that are considered historians giving us, again, history without nuance and proper contextual nuance, I should say. Let me keep going. Similarly, it downplays the regime's achievements through a consistent yes but framing. For instance, while acknowledging economic stabilization, improved infrastructure, and reconciliation with the Vatican, Max Smith quickly qualifies these successes by emphasizing their authoritarian costs. According to the critique, this method prevents a balanced assessment and diminishes the complexity of the fascist era. While moral judgment is valid, the complete dismissal of practical successes can lead to historical distortions. Max Smith also presents Mussolini as both an autocrat and a puppet of Italy's industrial and military elites, a contradiction inadequately explored. In fact, Mussolini often acted independently and sometimes opposed the elite interests when it suited his political ends. Again, a lot of this doesn't make sense, right? Italy didn't have a whole lot of industry. It was largely agriculture. It had some, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it had none, but also, too, when it came to the military industrial complex, one of the great weaknesses for Italy, apart from being somewhat technologically behind from the Allied powers, was the fact that all of Mussolini's generals betrayed him or failed or were terrible or lied to him, right? Let me keep reading. Another neglected area is the international admiration Mussolini received in the 1920s and 30s. Figures like Winston Churchill, P.T. Martinetti, De Valera, Yeats, George Bernard Shaw, and Ezra Pound expressed admiration for him, as did prominent Americans such as Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, Charles Limbaugh. Max Smith's omission of these perspectives weakens his portrayal of Mussolini's global influence during that period. Mussolini was seen as, at the time, this is me speaking here, guys, Mussolini was seen as the great central figure of European politics. Everybody went to Mussolini, especially when it came to dealing with, again, the failed Austrian painter in Germany. Everybody appealed to Mussolini. He was very widely respected all over the place. But again, we're dealing with history in the post-war consensus, right? And we're missing points here. Again, it sounds like another ideological leftist bias here. Let me keep going. Military successes under fascism are similarly underplayed. The 1935-36 war in Ethiopia, for example, is described primarily in terms of Italian war crimes, notably the use of chemical weapons. While these actions are rightly condemned, Max Smith ignores both the military and political effectiveness of the campaign, as well as the historical context of European colonial expansion, in which Italy participated alongside other powers. Moreover, earlier failed Italian efforts to conquer Ethiopia predated fascism entirely, but this continuity is not acknowledged. Okay, yes, colonialism, we could talk about the morality of colonialism, but everybody was doing it. Italy was simply late to the party and kind of got the crap left over on the geopolitical map. The Americans were doing it. The British had their empire. The French had their empire, right? Everybody was doing it. And in terms of the chemical weapons, Yeah, I mean, we have the British who make that claim that the Italians used it because the British were backing the Ethiopians. But even the chemical weapons that were used were a response to the Ethiopians using dum-dum bullets, right? That were condemned by international law. It was a response by the Italians, right? A tit for tat, because the Ethiopians were not, again, honoring international law in war. Keep that in mind. Finally, the biography's coverage of Mussolini's downfall is rushed and emotionally detached, though Max Smith makes valid points about Italy's unpreparedness for total war and the weakness of its military leadership. He exaggerates Mussolini's cowardice and omits personal losses, such as the death of his two sons who served in the army during the war. The dictator's final years are dramatic and are treated briefly, denying readers of the most comprehensive view of his decline. In sum, while Mussolini is valuable for its information detail, it offers a selective, ideologically slanted view of its subject. By failing to provide sufficient historical context, acknowledge real accomplishment, or explore Mussolini's appeal and contradictions, the book ultimately lacks the depth and balance needed for a full understanding of one of the 20th century's most consequential figures. And there you have it there. Basically, another book with more liberal bias. And again, guys, I wanted to go through this to show you how this works at the end of the day. And some of the challenges I've had here to try and be historically accurate, at least as accurate as I can be, being fair to history. I'm not, I've told you before, I'm not a hoorah Mussolini guy, but I'm also not an anti-Mussolini guy as well, too. I treat this historical figure with great respect because he was a consequential figure. He was an important figure that had lots of great accomplishments, but also had weaknesses and lots of great failures. I've highlighted this on this cast. But the hardest part for me, again, is working through all these different historical narratives and people that call themselves historians, trying to figure out which are the most trusted sources. This is why I've stuck, again, with the Renzo Di Felice school of thought, because he sticks with the facts. You're not getting the politics. You're getting the facts. You're getting the documents that he's read. You're getting, again, the historical narrative as dictated by the events of its time. It removes the politics and he sticks to the facts. These other three examples of historians that I gave you, you see the liberal bias in play. This is what we have to work through, and this is why it's so difficult to nail down Benito Mussolini and the history of Italian fascism, because it is so despised by the liberal world that a lot of its sort of its what do you want to say? The viewpoints that have been created have been distorted by this liberal bias. Remember, fascism and Italy in that time never really had defenders after the war. You know, what is the old saying? The winners get to write history. This is exactly what has happened. I tried to give a more balanced view that the Italians had some struggles. They were real. Fascism had its purposes. Was it good? Was it bad? In some cases, I think it was good. Some cases, the power, yeah, there was an abuse of that. I think that's pretty clear. But we also have to understand, in the fight for politics and survival of a nation, as we see today in the liberal West that's fallen apart, sometimes, well, some strenuous actions need to be taken. I've said it. I just think fascism in Italy, and only Italy, was right for its time to push out the Marxists that were coming in. It was the only way that Italy was going to survive. And we see some of this imbalance as we get historians of the Spanish Civil War that give us a similar history to label Franco over there as some brutal dictator and, who terrorized the Spanish people, when in fact there's more context to that. And so this post-war narrative that we've been given about the Catholic Latin nation or Catholic nations has come from a bias not only from communists, but Protestant Anglo republics that have always despised the Latin Catholic nations. Let's always keep that in mind. I just wanted to highlight here that the liberal bias exists even in when you show up to a library or show up to a bookstore and you got this supposed guy who's a historian and a professional academic in Italian fascism and Benito Mussolini, and they're going to tell you the story. They're going to tell you the story, right? But can they remove their own political biases? 3 examples here I gave tonight, 3, where they appear they can't remove their political biases. That's why you come here to get the story, right? Mussolini, an Italian-American perspective. I give it fair and balanced, guys. You're not going to get liberal politics. You're not going to get me kissing and hugging or canonizing Mussolini. You're going to get the truth here, or at least as best as I can siphon through it, right? I'm not perfect. There you have it, guys. Mussolini, once again, an Italian-American perspective. This is part 41, a long one as well, too. I want to thank you for joining me. This is Frank, signing off for Frankly Speaking. Good night, everybody.